It had been just another calm morning in Willow Creek Estates, the kind of suburban neighborhood where the lawns were always trimmed to the exact inch, and every mailbox was painted the same shade of white. It was peaceful, predictable even. That is, until the arrival of one woman, Karen Holloway, the self-proclaimed acting president of the HOA. I had moved into the neighborhood barely a year before, trying to escape city chaos for something quieter, more rural. My small property sat at the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction, surrounded by open fields and a few sugarcane plots that I helped maintain. I'd built my own wooden fence, solid, clean, and sturdy, to mark the property line. Nothing fancy, but I was proud of it. For a few months, things went smoothly. Then, the complaints began. It started small, notes left in my mailbox about non-compliant lawn growth and unregistered agricultural equipment visible from the street. I ignored them at first, figuring it was just a busybody with too much time. But then one afternoon, Karen appeared at my doorstep. She had the look, the oversized sunglasses, clipboard, and that sharp tone of authority that only someone drunk on neighborhood power could possess. She claimed to be performing random property inspections, which wasn't unusual for the HOA, except she seemed obsessed with mine. She made remarks about my sugarcane loader, my fence design, even the shade of my driveway gravel. Every week, another notice. Every visit, another petty demand. Things took a turn when she accused me of unauthorized modifications to my backyard fencing. I tried to explain it was a replacement, an upgrade even, but she wasn't interested in explanations. She wanted confrontation. I began to notice her SUV parked near my property, sometimes late at night, sometimes early morning, always with that same suspicious posture, camera phone in hand, snapping photos over my fence. Once, she even stepped onto my land, pretending to measure something with a tape reel. I warned her, politely but firmly, that she was trespassing. She scoffed and said, "As HOA president, I can inspect anything within my jurisdiction." That line would become her mantra, and my motivation. Weeks passed, and the tension built. I could feel her trying to provoke me. I caught her talking to neighbors, whispering about non-compliance and code violations. Soon, I started getting letters not just from her, but from the official HOA office, each one citing vague infractions and threats of fines. Then came the day everything changed. It was early morning. I was out near the fence, tightening a few bolts and trimming the grass along the edges. That's when I heard it. The growl of an engine revving, louder than usual, too close for comfort. Before I could even turn around, Karen's silver SUV came barreling down the lane, straight into my fence. Wood splintered. Dust flew. My tools scattered across the yard. I stood frozen as the front bumper of her SUV crumpled against the boards, the fence snapping like toothpicks under the impact. The sight was surreal. She didn't even look panicked, just angry, like she'd proven some sort of point. When I rushed toward the wreckage, she jumped out, waving her clipboard and shouting about unauthorized barriers and illegal extensions beyond HOA-approved boundaries. According to her, the crash was part of her inspection, an attempt to test the durability of a potential hazard. It was absurd, unreal, but she was dead serious. She took pictures of the damage, wrote something on her clipboard, and said I'd be liable for property obstruction. Then she stormed off, leaving behind a shattered fence and a cloud of dust. Neighbors peeked from their driveways, whispering, phones in hand, filming the aftermath. I felt humiliated, angry, and helpless all at once. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about principle. That night, as I sat in my workshop repairing what I could, a thought began to take shape. I looked at my sugarcane loader, a massive piece of machinery that could lift a small car like it was a toy. I thought about how she'd rammed her SUV into my fence, how she'd violated my space again and again, all under the guise of inspection. Maybe it was time I gave her a real inspection. I didn't want revenge, not yet, but I did want justice, something poetic, something that would make her understand that actions have consequences, even for self-appointed HOA tyrants. and as I ran my hand along the cold metal of the sugarcane loader, the plan began to form. Precise, careful, and perfectly legal. She wanted to play inspector? Fine. But soon she'd find herself inspected, lifted, and humbled in a way she'd never forget. The neighborhood had seen Karen's wrath long enough. It was time someone showed her what it felt like to be on the other end of her authority. And as the night grew darker, the plan became clearer. The next time she came uninvited, there would be no shouting, no confrontation, no threats. Just a lesson. A slow smile crossed my face as the loader's engine rumbled to life. Tomorrow, Karen would come again. She always did. And this time, she'd leave a little lighter. Literally. The morning after the crash, the air in Willow Creek Estates felt heavier. The fence still lay splintered in the grass, a jagged reminder of how far Karen Holloway's obsession had gone. The front of her silver SUV had left a deep indentation in the soil, the ground torn where her tires had spun after impact. I spent the early hours documenting everything: photos, measurements, timestamps. It wasn't for the HOA or for the police. It was for me, to remember this exact moment when patience ran out. While most neighbors would have called law enforcement, I knew that route would lead nowhere. Karen had her connections, her fabricated authority, and a knack for twisting situations until she appeared as the victim. She had likely already spun the story to the HOA board, painting herself as a dutiful inspector who had accidentally collided with a non-compliant fence during her routine inspection. So, instead of fighting her through the endless paper maze of HOA politics, I decided to plan something different, something symbolic. I wasn't going to yell or threaten or stoop to her level. I would simply demonstrate that actions have weight, and I had just the machine for it. Behind my property sat the sugarcane loader, a large rust-colored beast of a machine I used during harvest season. It had hydraulic arms capable of lifting nearly 2 tons. Over the years, it had saved me hours of backbreaking work, loading cane stalks into transport trucks. Now it would have a new purpose. The idea wasn't born from malice. It was about poetic justice. Karen had rammed into my fence under the guise of inspection. Fine. The next time she came to inspect, she would be the one under examination. Over the next 2 days, I prepared. I repaired the damaged section of the fence, but this time, I reinforced it. Steel posts hidden inside the wooden panels, bolted deep into concrete. To anyone else it looked exactly the same, but it was unyielding now. I even painted the boards slightly darker, concealing the metal sheen beneath. Then, I positioned the loader strategically near my shed, angled in such a way that I could maneuver it quickly toward the driveway if needed. I greased the hydraulics, checked the lift arms, and made sure everything was silent and responsive. The loader purred like a cat when I started it. Smooth, ready, patient. I didn't have to wait long. By the end of the week, Karen's silver SUV was back on my street. She parked farther away this time, perhaps wary after the crash, but her routine was the same. Clipboard in hand, camera phone ready, scanning my property for violations that didn't exist. She circled near the repaired fence, inspecting the fresh paint like a hawk. I watched her from my workshop window, heart steady, mind clear. I knew what I was doing might draw attention, but I also knew I was well within my rights. She was trespassing. Again. When she leaned against the fence, pressing a measuring stick through the slats, I stepped outside. She saw me, of course, but in true Karen fashion, pretended not to. I didn't say a word. I simply walked past her toward the loader, acting as though I were minding my own business. I could feel her eyes on me, suspicious, judgmental. That was good. It kept her distracted long enough for me to start the loader's engine without her realizing what was coming next. The loader hummed low as I backed it toward the driveway. I positioned it perfectly, just a few feet behind her SUV, which she had conveniently left partially on my property line. That was her favorite move, parking half in, half out, so she could claim she wasn't technically trespassing. But this time, I had photographic proof that her vehicle was over the line. Karen moved toward her SUV when she noticed the machine idling behind it. I stayed calm, keeping the loader's arms low, inching closer, waiting for her to reach for her camera. Because she always did. And right on cue, she lifted her phone, snapping pictures of me as though I were the one breaking the rules. That was when I engaged the hydraulics. The loader's twin forks slid effortlessly beneath the front axle of her SUV. The metal groaned softly under the pressure. Then, slowly, deliberately, the entire front of the vehicle began to rise. Karen froze. Her phone dropped into the grass as she watched her prized SUV tilt upward, its front tires dangling helplessly above the ground. The loader's engine barely strained. It was built for lifting tons of cane, not a lightweight suburban vehicle. I lifted it just high enough for the point to land, not enough to cause damage. It wasn't about destruction. It was about demonstration. I held it there for a few seconds, the SUV's back tires still on the ground, the front suspended in the air like a warning. The neighbors had begun to notice by now. Curtains twitched, and camera phones appeared. Karen stood speechless, for once unable to summon her usual torrent of threats and HOA jargon. When I lowered the SUV back down, the ground seemed to tremble slightly beneath the impact. The loader hissed as the hydraulics released pressure, and the machine fell silent again. Karen backed away slowly, her face pale, her hands trembling. Without a word, she climbed into her vehicle, turned the ignition, and sped off. No clipboard, no photos, no accusations. Just silence and the distant sound of tires squealing on asphalt. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming peace, about setting a boundary that words couldn't enforce. The entire neighborhood saw it, and though no one said anything directly, I could feel the shift. The whispers stopped, the sideways glances faded, and for the first time in months, my property was left alone. That night I parked the loader back near the shed and shut off the lights. The stars above the cane fields flickered like tiny witnesses to the strange justice that had unfolded. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel triumphant either, just relieved. But peace in Willow Creek Estates never lasted long. Karen's silence wasn't defeat. It was calculation. She was the kind of person who couldn't let things go, the type who viewed any loss as a personal attack on her authority. And sure enough, the next morning a new letter arrived, delivered not by hand, but through certified mail. It bore the HOA's seal and a long list of reported violations, including use of industrial machinery within residential limits, reckless endangerment, and property intimidation. She had turned the tables. Again, the HOA was now launching an investigation, and the letter demanded that I attend a formal hearing at the community hall the following week. It was clear. Karen wasn't backing down. She was escalating. I had lifted her SUV, but now she wanted to lift my life apart, one rule and regulation at a time. The week leading up to the HOA hearing was heavy with tension. Each morning I woke to find new eyes watching me. Neighbors who once waved politely now avoided making contact. The news of what I'd done to Karen's SUV had spread like wildfire, twisting and growing with every retelling. Some called me reckless. Others whispered that I was a hero for finally standing up to her. But regardless of opinion, everyone knew the HOA wouldn't let it go quietly. The official letter had been thick with legal language, stuffed with vague accusations about unsafe use of machinery, aggressive conduct, and violation of community decorum. It was absurd, but I understood what it really meant. Karen had gotten to the board first. She was controlling the narrative, painting herself as the victim of an unhinged homeowner who had endangered her safety. Still, I wasn't afraid. I had evidence, photos, timestamps, security footage of her ramming into my fence, and proof that she had trespassed multiple times before. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the story without showing the truth. On the morning of the hearing, I arrived early at the community hall. The room was small but formal enough to feel intimidating. A long oak table at the front, chairs arranged in neat rows, and the HOA board members already seated like judges waiting for trial to begin. Karen sat among them, a smug smile resting beneath her oversized sunglasses. Her SUV incident hadn't slowed her down. If anything, it had fueled her. As the session began, The board chair read through the list of allegations, each one phrased to make me sound dangerous. Reckless use of agricultural equipment, threatening HOA personnel, public endangerment. It was almost impressive how quickly Karen had spun her story. When they finally allowed me to speak, I presented my evidence methodically. The video of her SUV crossing onto my property line, the sound of her engine revving before impact, the photographs of her standing with a measuring stick beyond the fence boundary. I even had the repair receipts showing that the damage came from her side. The board members exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. For the first time, Karen's confident expression faltered. She hadn't expected me to be prepared, but what she did next was classic Karen. She pivoted. Instead of denying what she'd done, she claimed that she was conducting an official HOA boundary check, and that my aggressive response had created an unsafe environment for community officials. She used phrases like emotional distress, trauma, and fear. For personal safety, she knew exactly how to play the victim. As I listened, I realized this wasn't about rules or safety. It was about control. Karen needed to win, not because she was right, but because losing meant losing the image of authority she'd built around herself. After hours of back-and-forth discussion, the board concluded the hearing with a temporary suspension of my property privileges, whatever that meant. They said a final decision would come in writing within 2 weeks. It was vague, intentionally so, a bureaucratic trap designed to buy Karen more time. When I left the hall, the whispers followed me. A few neighbors nodded quietly, some gave sympathetic glances, but most stayed silent. The community that once ignored Karen's antics now seemed to fear her. Her power wasn't in the rules, it was in the fear she created. That night, I sat in my workshop again, surrounded by the hum of machines and the smell of oil and steel. My fence stood repaired, my land secure, but I could feel the storm brewing beyond the borders. Karen wouldn't stop. If she couldn't defeat me through physical intimidation, she'd use policy and paperwork to choke me out. I started thinking strategically. The HOA had rules, yes, but they also had limits. There were bylaws about privacy, land boundaries, and overreach of authority. I began to read through every document I could find, analyzing every clause, every loophole. If Karen wanted to play by the book, I would learn the book better than she ever had. Days passed. The tension didn't fade, it evolved. I noticed her SUV driving slower past my property, her phone camera always ready. She was documenting everything: my yard, my shed, even my sugarcane fields. I began to suspect she was building a new case, collecting evidence for another attack. Then, one evening, something strange happened. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw her SUV parked just beyond the fence line again. The headlights were off, but the glow of her phone screen flickered through the window. She was waiting for something. Watching. When I approached, she sped away, tires crunching against the gravel, disappearing into the night. It was becoming clear that this was no longer about HOA enforcement. It was personal. The next morning, another letter arrived. Not from the HOA this time, but from the county zoning office. It claimed there had been a formal complaint about unauthorized industrial equipment usage within residential limits. That was Karen's latest move. She was escalating it to the county level, weaponizing bureaucracy to corner me legally. I knew what I had to do. It was time to go on the offensive, not through violence or intimidation, but through proof. I gathered every record of communication, every image of her trespassing, and even testimonies from a few brave neighbors who had witnessed her harassment firsthand. Slowly, I was building a counter case strong enough to expose her manipulations once and for all. But before I could act, something unexpected happened. Late one night, a loud crash echoed across the field. When I rushed outside, I saw the faint glow of headlights near the same section of the fence she'd destroyed before. My heart sank. I knew that sound. Karen had done it again. Her SUV was half submerged in the ditch beside my property. The front bumper smashed, one tire spinning uselessly in the mud. She must have been trying to take more photos in the dark when she veered too close to the edge. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching the scene unfold under the dim light of the moon. Part of me felt anger, but another part felt something else entirely. Exhaustion. How far would she go to prove she was right? How long could one person chase control before losing everything else? I called emergency services, not out of sympathy, but because it was the right thing to do. By the time they arrived, neighbors had gathered again, whispering and recording. The paramedics checked her over, shaken but unharmed. Her SUV, though, was another story. As they towed it away, I caught her staring at me from the passenger seat, her face pale, her expression unreadable. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't arrogance. It was fear, but fear has a way of turning into something darker. This wasn't over. The morning after Karen's late-night crash was eerily quiet. The usual chirping of the neighborhood birds and the low hum of distant lawnmowers were gone. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the kind of stillness that only follows a scandal. Word had spread fast. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the Willow Creek HOA, had crashed her SUV into the same fence she had once inspected. But what most didn't know was that the crash hadn't stopped her. It had only hardened her resolve. While her SUV sat mangled at a local repair shop, Karen was already back to scheming. The silence was deceptive. Behind the scenes, she was working to rebuild her power. This time not through petty HOA violations, but through manipulation, influence, and paperwork. Within a few days, the first signs appeared. HOA patrols, usually rare, became a daily occurrence. Two members I had barely spoken to before now walked past my property every morning, clipboards in hand, pretending to take notes. A new community compliance task force was announced via newsletter, supposedly to restore order and safety after recent property incidents. It was clear what that meant. Karen had weaponized the board. Every small thing suddenly became a violation. A patch of grass slightly overgrown after a storm. A trailer left out for maintenance. Even the sugarcane loader, which had been parked neatly behind my shed for years, was now labeled industrial machinery in a residential zone. The letters came daily, each one colder, more precise. Threats of fines, warnings of property liens, mentions of potential expulsion from the HOA. It was no longer harassment. It was warfare through paperwork. I kept my calm, documenting everything, photographing every notice, every patrol. I refused to give her what she wanted, a reaction. Still, I could feel her eyes on me. Sometimes I would glance across the street and catch a glimpse of her through her window. One curtain slightly pulled back, her silhouette unmoving. She was watching, always watching. But then things escalated further. One evening just after sunset, I noticed tire tracks leading across my side lawn. Fresh ones. I followed them with a flashlight, and they led right to the rear section of my sugarcane field. There, half hidden by the tall stalks, I found a small surveillance camera mounted on a fence post. It wasn't mine. Someone had placed it there to monitor my property. The make and model matched the kind used by the HOA for security monitoring around the clubhouse. I knew instantly whose idea it was. Karen had installed cameras to spy on me, pretending it was for neighborhood safety. I took photos of it all and removed the camera carefully, preserving it as evidence. This wasn't just invasion of privacy. It was illegal surveillance. I contacted a local attorney that night and explained everything. He listened carefully and agreed to help me compile a formal case, one that could not only expose Karen, but also challenge the HOA's abuse of power. While the legal wheels began to turn slowly, Karen ramped up her psychological tactics. She began sending newsletters to all residents, passive-aggressive, carefully worded essays about dangerous equipment, reckless property owners, and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. Though she never mentioned me by name, everyone knew who she was talking about. Soon, I noticed fewer friendly waves from neighbors. Conversation stopped when I approached. Even the mail carrier seemed reluctant to linger too long near my gate. Karen had successfully turned perception against me. But perception wasn't truth. I knew that eventually, proof would prevail. A week later, The HOA called for an emergency town meeting. The notice claimed it was to discuss the rising safety concerns within the neighborhood. I attended, though I could feel the tension in the air the moment I entered the hall. People sat stiffly in their chairs, whispering, glancing at me, then quickly looking away. Karen stood at the front of the room, her arm in a sling from the crash, her expression solemn and full of practiced sorrow. She began recounting her version of events, how she had been performing a lawful inspection, how I had threatened her with machinery, and how her accident was the result of unprovoked hostility. Every word was carefully crafted to make her the martyr. She spoke of fear, of community danger, of needing to protect the residents from unpredictable individuals. The way she said it, you'd think I was some kind of menace lurking in the shadows. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply played the footage, clear, unedited, time-stamped, of her first crash into my fence, of her trespassing, and of the loader lifting her SUV harmlessly without damage. The room went silent. The truth was undeniable. People exchanged looks, whispers spreading again. But this time, the tone had changed. Karen's face turned pale. Her carefully built image of authority began to crumble right there under the flickering fluorescent lights of the hall. But Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. The next morning, she retaliated. When I stepped outside, my mailbox was gone, ripped clean off the post and thrown into the ditch. A bright orange HOA violation notice had been taped to my front door, stating that I was in violation of community decorum for unauthorized property alterations. I could only laugh at the irony. That day, I installed security cameras of my own, high definition, motion-triggered with remote backup storage. I knew Karen would strike again, but this time I would be ready, and she did. Late that night, around midnight, the cameras caught movement near my property line. Two figures, one clearly Karen, the other likely one of her loyal HOA members, were seen planting something near the fence. The next morning I found what it was: spray-painted markings along the ground, new boundary indicators, clearly designed to make it look like I'd built my fence beyond the official line. She was fabricating evidence now. I realized then that this had gone beyond HOA harassment. This was obsession. She wasn't just trying to fine me or control my property. She wanted to destroy my reputation, my peace, maybe even push me out of the neighborhood entirely. But if she thought intimidation and lies would win, she underestimated the one thing I still had: proof. I contacted my lawyer again, this time providing the new footage. He told me that what she'd done now constituted criminal trespassing and property tampering. Together, we began preparing a formal complaint not just against Karen, but against the entire HOA board for enabling her behavior. The battle lines were drawn, and this time, it was going to court. As I stood by the fence that evening, watching the sun sink behind the sugarcane field, I knew this was far from over. The peace I once sought in Willow Creek Estates had been shattered, replaced by a quiet determination. Karen had tried to break my will. Instead, she'd hardened it. The next chapter wouldn't be fought with fences or loaders, but with facts, witnesses, and truth. And this time, I wasn't just defending my property. I was fighting for every neighbor she'd ever bullied into silence. By the time the lawsuit was officially filed, Willow Creek Estates was no longer the quiet, postcard-perfect neighborhood it once pretended to be. The cracks in its manicured facade were visible to anyone paying attention. The neighbors had split into factions: those who quietly admired my defiance against Karen, and those too fearful or complicit to stand against her authority. What had started as a petty feud over a fence had evolved into a community-wide reckoning. The days leading up to the first court hearing were a blur of paperwork, statements, and sleepless nights. My attorney, a calm and meticulous man named Reynolds, built the case like an architect, piece by piece, methodically. He wanted every detail to fit so tightly that there would be no room for the HOA or Karen to twist the truth again. We gathered everything: security footage of Karen trespassing, recordings of her verbal confrontations, copies of every false violation, letter, and photographic proof of the spray-painted boundary markers she'd planted at night. We even included testimony from 2 neighbors who finally decided they'd had enough of her intimidation. Their accounts painted the same picture: a woman obsessed with control, willing to bend and break every rule to get her way. Karen, however, didn't retreat. She doubled down. The HOA announced it would be backing her in the case, claiming that my actions and attitude had caused irreparable harm to the community's sense of safety. They framed themselves as the victims of a homeowner who weaponized heavy machinery and created a hostile living environment. It was absurd, but effective. They were trying to drown me in legal jargon and procedural delay, hoping I'd get tired, broke, or both. But I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The footage of Karen's second crash, the one that ended with her SUV half-submerged in the ditch, had circulated quietly among residents. Someone had leaked it. And in that grainy night video, her recklessness was undeniable. The moment it hit local online forums, public opinion began to shift. Karen's iron grip on the HOA started to weaken. People were beginning to see her not as a leader, but as a liability. Still, she acted as though she owned the place. Every HOA email was signed off with her trademark tone of authority, every message dripping with veiled threats about upholding the standards of Willow Creek. As the court date approached, the atmosphere turned electric. The HOA tried one last move, a cease and desist order demanding that I remove the sugarcane loader from my property, citing it as a nuisance to community harmony. Reynolds laughed when he read it. The loader was properly licensed, insured, and stored within the property's agricultural zoning exemption. Karen's attempt at banning it only made her look more unhinged. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was small, sterile, and humming with low whispers as neighbors trickled in, curious to witness the spectacle. Karen entered wearing her usual air of superiority: immaculate blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a cast on her wrist that she clearly didn't need anymore. She was playing the part of the victim to perfection. The HOA's attorney began the proceedings with a rehearsed statement about community integrity and property safety. He framed the entire incident as an escalation caused by my alleged aggression and disregard for HOA authority. But when it was our turn, Reynolds dismantled their claims one by one. He played the footage, every piece of evidence in chronological order. Karen trespassing, her SUV crashing into my fence, the loader lifting her car gently with no damage, her surveillance camera hidden among my sugarcane, the spray-painted fake boundary lines. Every lie she had spun was laid bare under the sterile glow of courtroom lights. The judge listened quietly, expression unreadable, but I could feel the tide turning. Even Karen's composure began to crack. Her once stiff posture slumped. The whispering in the room grew louder. When the testimonies began, 2 neighbors took the stand, one elderly couple who had lived in Willow Creek for years. They described how Karen had harassed them too, citing made-up violations, threatening fines for imaginary rule breaches, and even blocking their mail delivery once when they refused to side with her. Their voices trembled, but their words were powerful. By the time Reynolds delivered his closing argument, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't a homeowner gone rogue. It was a community under siege by one woman's obsession with control. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the silence was suffocating. Karen was found guilty of multiple infractions: trespassing, property damage, and defamation. The HOA, as an enabling body, was fined for failing to enforce its own bylaws properly. The court ordered that Karen be removed from any leadership position within the HOA immediately. She was also required to pay restitution for the damage to my fence and legal fees. The decision hit her like a physical blow. She didn't cry, but her face drained of color. For the first time since this all began, she wasn't in control. The gavel struck the desk, echoing like a final punctuation mark on months of chaos. But even as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew it wasn't the end. People like Karen didn't just disappear. They festered. They plotted. I could almost feel it in the way she stared at me as I left, her expression cold and distant, her mind already working on the next move. Still, for a brief moment, there was peace. In the days that followed, the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from her. New elections were announced, and for the first time in years, residents actually volunteered to run. The oppressive fear that had blanketed Willow Creek began to lift. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months were chatting again, smiling, helping one another rebuild the community spirit Karen had poisoned. I repaired my fence once more, not because it was broken, but because it felt symbolic. Each plank I placed was a reminder that boundaries mattered. Not just physical ones, but personal ones. Karen had crossed both, and she had finally faced the consequences. The sugarcane loader sat quietly in the shed, its work complete. I thought of selling it, but I decided against it. It had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of standing one's ground. Still, the quiet didn't last. A week after the court ruling, as I walked to the end of my driveway, I found something odd. A single envelope sat in the mailbox, unmarked except for a faint fingerprint smudge. Inside was a photo, grainy, taken at night, showing my property from across the street. No words, no threats. Just the image. Karen might have lost the battle, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. The quiet that followed the court case was deceptive, like the eye of a storm pretending to be peace. On the surface, Willow Creek Estates looked restored. Lawns neatly trimmed, mailboxes upright. The HOA newsletter now cheerful and polite. Karen had been officially removed from the board, her influence stripped, her power severed. But beneath that facade, tension still lingered, coiled like a spring waiting to snap. The mysterious photo left in my mailbox proved it. Someone was still watching me, studying my property from the shadows. Whether it was Karen herself or one of her few remaining loyalists didn't matter. The intent was the same: intimidation. For days, nothing else happened. No new letters, no confrontations. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. At night I would stand by my window, staring out at the sugarcane fields that bordered my property, their tall stalks whispering softly in the wind. The peace that I had fought so hard for now felt fragile, temporary. Then, one night, it shattered. It was just past midnight when I woke to the faint hum of an engine. At first I thought it was distant, someone passing by on the main road. But the sound grew louder, closer, until it vibrated through the floorboards. I looked out the window and froze. A vehicle's headlights were cutting through the dark, slowly moving across my yard. The beams swept across the grass, across the rebuilt fence, and then stopped. The silver SUV. Karen's SUV. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone and hit record, stepping out into the cool night air. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached cautiously. The engine idled, its headlights blinding, and for a moment I thought she might have lost her mind completely. Then I saw her. Karen sat behind the wheel, her expression eerily calm, her face illuminated by the glow of her dashboard. Her eyes were hollow, not the sharp, calculating look of the HOA tyrant I'd known, but something darker, something broken. She revved the engine once, twice, and then slammed the accelerator. The SUV lunged forward, straight toward the fence again. This time, I was ready. The reinforced steel posts beneath the wooden panels held firm as the SUV collided, the front crumpling with a deafening crunch. The air filled with the screech of metal and the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator. The impact shook the ground, but the fence didn't give way. Karen's SUV stopped dead, its bumper embedded into the reinforced section. For a few seconds, everything was silent except for the ticking of the hot engine. Then I saw her hands gripping the steering wheel, trembling. She wasn't moving. I called emergency services immediately, reporting the crash. But as I stood there waiting, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just anger or defiance. This was obsession consuming itself. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood through fear had become a prisoner of her own fixation. When the flashing lights of the paramedics and police cars arrived, the entire neighborhood woke. Porch lights flicked on one by one, shadows gathering at driveways. The same people who had once whispered behind curtains now stood in stunned silence as officers pulled Karen from her vehicle. She was conscious, muttering incoherently, her words lost beneath the noise of radios and flashing sirens. They loaded her into the ambulance. She didn't look at me. Or maybe she couldn't. The once dominant HOA president was now just another casualty of her own pride. In the days that followed, the story spread fast. Some said she had suffered a breakdown. Others claimed she had been planning something worse, perhaps to vandalize my property again or even provoke another confrontation. No one knew for sure, but everyone agreed on one thing. She was gone for good. Karen moved out a few weeks later. Her house, once pristine and obsessively maintained, sat empty, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. The HOA replaced her name on the directory board, and a new president took over. A quieter, more reasonable person who focused on rebuilding trust rather than enforcing power. The tension that had hung over Willow Creek Estates began to dissolve. The neighbors started talking again, sharing laughs over fences instead of complaints. The compliance patrols were disbanded, and the petty violation letters stopped entirely. For the first time since moving there, I could feel a genuine sense of community. Still, I couldn't fully relax. The memory of that night lingered. The sound of her SUV hitting the fence, the look in her eyes, the madness that had consumed her. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand outside and look at that same section of the fence, still marked by faint dents from the crash. I left them there intentionally, a reminder of how far things had gone, and how fragile sanity can be when power becomes obsession. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I focused on my sugarcane fields, on work, on rebuilding the peace that had been stolen. The HOA operated quietly now, fair and transparent. The community had learned a hard lesson about authority and accountability. Then, one spring morning, as I was checking the field, I found something near the fence line, a small, weathered clipboard half buried in the dirt. Its metal clip was rusted, the paper inside faded, but I recognized it instantly. It was Karen's. The last page was still legible. Written in her familiar sharp handwriting was a note that simply read, "Inspection incomplete." I stood there for a long moment, the wind rustling through the cane fields around me. It wasn't fear I felt this time, just an uneasy sort of closure. Karen's story had ended, but the echo of her presence lingered, a cautionary tale burned into the soil of Willow Creek itself. In the months that followed, her house sold to a young family. They knew nothing of the history, nothing of the war that had once been fought over fences and pride. They planted flowers, painted the shutters, and laughed in the yard, sounds that the neighborhood hadn't heard in a long time. And me, I kept the sugarcane loader parked near the shed, not because I needed it every day, but because it reminded me of a truth most people never learn until it's too late. Boundaries are meant to protect, not provoke. When someone crosses them again and again, they eventually meet something immovable. For me, that something had been a fence. For Karen, it had been herself. The HOA that once stood as her empire now functioned as it should have all along, a simple system for keeping the neighborhood orderly, not a weapon for control. The fear she had cultivated was gone, replaced by the kind of quiet that comes only after a long storm. As the sun set one evening, I stood by the repaired fence for the last time, the golden light reflecting off the sturdy boards. The sugarcane swayed gently in the breeze behind me, the same fields that had witnessed every step of this strange battle. Karen's story had ended here, and so had mine. Not in rage, not in revenge, but in peace earned through resilience. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or confrontations. It comes from standing firm, refusing to bend, and letting the truth speak louder than anyone's authority ever could. And in Willow Creek Estates, That truth still stood tall, just like my fence.